Hello, and welcome to the Psych Leadership Podcast, the podcast where we discuss the intersection between psychology, leadership, and what it means to your small business. As always, my name's Luke Upchurch, and I'm happy that you took time out of your busy day to hang out with me a little bit. So, picking up on last week's episode, we talked about thriving or toxic, how culture shapes your team's growth. I went through some details around how do we define culture, shared some anecdotes around both thriving as well as toxic culture, and then we got into the weeds a little bit on both of those examples. We even touched a little bit on the psychology behind culture and how that bleeds into the work that you do with your team each and every day. So today we're going to build a little bit onto that, and we'll talk about the role of leadership in shaping culture. We'll get into how to turn around a bad culture and some call to action for each and every one of you. So first off, the role of leadership in creating culture. I talked a lot about this in the first episode, this idea that as the leader, you set the stage with your team. This is both in your direct actions, but also in the subliminal actions that your team witnesses. Okay? So something as simple as, do you end meetings on time? Do you put content for the meetings, as in an agenda, or do you just send them something? Do you expect immediate action from your team just because you sent them an instant message? Or do you respect the fact that the whole dynamic of instant messages on platforms like Teams or Skype or anything like that, or even a text message, the whole dynamic of those communications is that they are asynchronous, meaning get back to me when you can. Yes, it's professional to acknowledge the message, but at the same time, if you don't jump just because I said, hey, doesn't necessarily mean that I'm upset at that as a leader, right? Or maybe it does, right? It depends on the culture that you're trying to build. So, as a leader, the role that we shape within our team is is just like, as I mentioned in the first episode there, it's just like a parent to their children, right? It's in what you say, but also in what you do. So how do you create some consistency there? Well, the first thing is to have consistency in your expectations. So I used to have a leader that would say, inspect what you expect, right? It had that model of, I expect these expectations, and you know that I expect these expectations because I'm going to inspect the work itself, right? If I say, for example, hey, can you design a PowerPoint presentation for me that includes these elements, and you already know that I expect it to follow company branding, then you also should anticipate that I'm going to call you on that if you miss the mark, right? That I'm going to inspect what I expect. So, because I create that consistency with my team over time, I have embedded that culture. So now, for example, to use that exact scenario, my team knows that if they're developing a PowerPoint presentation, that we have brand standards and that I want those followed, and that I want things, and these seem simple, but things like consistent fonts or consistent layout on slides, that I don't want things overly verbose as it relates to presentations. So that's just a rudimentary example, but I think you get my point. The next way that as a leader that you shape the culture is through transparency, listening, and feedback. So I talked about this a bit in my last podcast, the previous episode. I told you guys that anytime that a company gives a survey, that's the first part of an unspoken contract, right? I ask you the question, you have the right to give me any answer you want, not necessarily the one that I want you to want. Okay? So I'm going to talk to the guys for a minute. Every guy that's listening to this is going to immediately relate to what I'm saying, especially if you have a spouse. How often has your spouse said, "Hey, honey, what do you want for dinner?" And let's say you're going out. Maybe, well, even if you're making it at home, it still applies. They say, "What do you want for dinner?" Whatever you want, it's your choice. And then you start offering up ideas, and immediately it's, "Oh, I had that the other day," or that is too many carbs. I don't want that," or we whatever the excuse is. It was the message was anything that you want, it's your choice, right? So you feel like here's this power and they're handing it to you, right? Here's the ball, I'm passing it to you, husband. Choose the thing that you want. And then the action is different, right? They didn't necessarily want your opinion. In fact, there's a comedian out there that he says something to the effect of, he always tells his wife that he is that they're going to dinner and it's a surprise. And she says, "Well, I need to know how to dress. I need to know what to wear." And he goes, "It's your favorite restaurant." And she goes, "Oh, you're taking me to such and such a place." And he goes, "Oh, exactly, exactly. That's what I was thinking the whole time." Ladies, that wasn't what he was thinking the whole time. That means that you're incredibly indecisive and he's trying to get out of trying to read your mind by just getting you to tell him what you wanted in the first place. Well, it's the same kind of thing with leaders, right? If we ask a question, if I say, "Hey, so and so, hey, Joe, hey, Jane, will you do this project? Will you work on Saturday? Could you do XYZ thing?" I asked a question. I have to be open to the fact that they may say, "Hell no, I don't want to work on Saturday. No, I don't have time for that project. You've already given me enough stuff to do," right? I have to be open to listening to that feedback and accepting that it may not necessarily be what I wanted. And so going back to our to the ladies in the audience, please know I don't mean any disrespect by that. I'm just commenting on the human nature of every couple that's existed since the beginning of time. There's always one that believes that they are relinquishing the power by saying, "You pick, husband or wife, other person, right? You pick where we're going to have dinner." And they really didn't want you to pick. They just wanted you to go where they wanted to go in the first place, right? So have that transparency, be open and honest with both the listening and the feedback. If you ask a question, then be aware that the answer may not be something that you like. In fact, folks, in terms of setting the culture, understand not all of you listening to this are leaders. So I want to be clear when I say that just because you are not in a leadership position does not mean that you're not a leader. It doesn't mean that you are completely powerless as it relates to shaping the culture. And so going back to that husband and wife example, my wife has done that to me in the past. We've had that exact same conversation. Where do you want to go for dinner? It's your choice. And I throw out 10 options and all 10 of them suck. And we end up going where she wanted to go in the first place. And so I've given her that feedback and I've said, if you already had a place in mind, just lead with that. Don't pretend to give me credence. Don't pretend to allow me that autonomy if you're going to change it anyway. If it's really my opinion, then we can go wherever I decide I want to go, and you have to be willing to accept that. So, or the same kind of thing, I've had the same conversation with my boss. And whenever I join a new team, I tell my boss, "Hey, I'm a big boy. I know how to take orders, but if you're asking me a question, know that I have the autonomy to say no. I have the ability to push back. If it's an order, don't ask, right? Just tell me where to go and I'll go. You're paying me for a job. So as long as I find value in that job, I'm going to continue doing that thing, right? Same kind of thing with your spouse. They say, when I had that same conversation with my wife and said, don't ask the question if it's not a question. And I said it a lot nicer, guys. I'm not trying to sleep on the couch here. But you say, if it's not a question, then don't ask, and word that a little bit nicer to your spouse. But by giving that feedback, by letting them know this is how it was perceived, then assuming that they're emotionally mature enough to handle that, now you've bridged that gap. So now when my wife and I have that same conversation, she says, well, what do you want? It's completely your choice. I'll say, I'll ask her questions to help me with that choice, if you will. Right. So I kind of lead the witness a little bit and say, well, I was thinking this, but I wasn't sure how you'd feel about it. What do you think? Right. And now it becomes, instead of it's a me decision or a her decision, now it's a joint decision. And I do the same thing with my bosses. Right. If my boss is going to ask me a question and I know that it really isn't a question, that he's trying to lead me to a specific area, well, maybe I'll ask him some questions in return. Maybe we get there together. And that helps to shape that culture. So again, just because you're not a leader of people does not mean that you are completely powerless when it comes to shaping the culture of the team that you're on. Other things that you can do as a leader, and again, I use that term very loosely here, but other things that you can do to help create that culture is through creating rituals and routines that enforce the value. And I mean the value that your team aspires to. So going back to our first episode there, we talked about Eric Schein's model of organizational leadership. And in this model, recall this is the image I described as looking kind of like an iceberg, right? We have our artifacts, those are our visible surface level aspects or manifestations of culture, things like your dress code, office layout, terminology, that sort of thing. Then we have our espoused value. This is semi visible. So these are going to be things like your mission statement, your code of conduct, any kind of strategic goals or philosophies that you have. And then we have the basic underlying assumptions. This is the behavior, the human nature, the work ethic. Again, typically this is displayed as an iceberg, the idea being that there is a piece on that surface level, and then there are layers where we go down a level from that into the deeper level concepts. And really, this is the space that the creating of rituals and routines really matters. And so I'll give you a simplistic example. And I've talked about this a little bit before, but we're going to dive in a little bit deeper here. A lot of teams will talk about work-life balance. And so I had this team years ago, and the leader at the time actually put this on our Outlook calendar to block time off of our calendar. He called it digital detox. And so we would put this on the calendar from like 2 o'clock to 5 o'clock every Friday. And the whole point is that he was going to block off time on your calendar, and it wasn't a meeting. It was for you to get caught up on email, to plan for next week, to close out stuff for this week, basically to get yourself right from a work perspective so that over the weekend, you're not even looking at your Outlook. You're not pulling up Teams. Realistically, you shouldn't even be thinking about work when you're not working, right? Your job, they get you for 40 hours a week, maybe a little bit more, right? Your family deserves you to be in the here and now. Your work will replace you within a week, maybe two, if you were to drop dead of a heart attack or win the lottery or whatever. Your family can't. And so this leader was really of the mindset of, this is the culture I'm telling you. I log out at 5 o'clock every day. I don't answer emails before 8 a.m. every day, and I'm expecting my team to do the same. That was his mantra. So he really stressed that. In fact, he used to say, I asked this leader not too long after I started at Humana, I said, define a 40-hour work week. Because mind you, I had come from the retail space. I mentioned this in my last podcast. In the retail space, if you're not working, 50, 60 hours a week on a pretty consistent basis, they used to tease me and call me part-timer, right? Just when I was first getting used to that type of work schedule, and it was pretty normal to work 12 to 15 hours a day every single day. Um, and that's not to say that we wouldn't get off days, but frankly, I never remembered them because I was so physically and mentally exhausted. Well, you move to those salary level roles, that's your motivation. Those of you that are still seeking your education, this is why you do it, to move to those salary level roles so that you can actually have a life and be somebody outside of a good little worker. Okay. But so this boss, he used to schedule time every Friday, digital detox. Now he told us, he said, you own your own calendars. If you decide that a meeting is worthy to override this, that's fine, but you have now set the precedence. Now, if, for instance, if you let so and so's meeting override your digital detox, what if I need something? What if your other colleague needs something, right? Now you've already set the stage. You've said, well, this isn't super important. It's only as important as you allow it to be. And so the same boss did the same kind of thing with his lunch schedule. He would put on his schedule every Monday through Friday at 12 to 12:30 or 12:45, something like that. He would block off time for lunch. And it didn't matter how important your thing was, the thing that you needed him to be there for. If that was his lunchtime, something better be on fire. There better be an emergency. Something big must be happening for you to book over his lunch. And most of the time, he would just decline the invite. He would point blank tell you, you can see my calendar. This is my lunchtime. Please pick a time that I'm available. And over time, because he set that routine, because that was a ritual for him to take lunches, to have digital detox, well, that carried forward to me. And so now I do that with my team. We have a standard on our team that if you're going to put time on my calendar, I need an agenda. I need to understand, am I the best person to be there on that call, or should it be somebody else from my team? Because if I'm not going to add value by being there, then what's the point, right? You don't need 10 people from your team on the call. We probably only need the one person, right? So I need an agenda. And then I can make an intelligent decision about whether or not I should be there and if I'm the only person from our team needed for that. And so to this day, as a courtesy, I don't just straight decline the invites, but I will tentatively accept and I'll push back to the person and say something nice and, politically, respectfully, but hey, tell me why this meeting is important to me, and then I'll decide if I'm going to attend it. And I don't mean that to sound arrogant, folks. I mean that to say this is a culture that I'm trying to establish. My time is valuable and I respect your time. So I'm going to always put agenda items. I'm always going to say this is the reason for the meeting and the outcome expected from the meeting. And so I expect I inspect what I expect. If I receive a meeting that is less than that, I'm going to tentatively accept and give you the opportunity to fix your mistake. And if you don't fix your mistake, then I will not be at that meeting. And I also push on my team to do the exact same thing. If my team ever says to me that they have a meeting and they're not sure what it's about, I tell them to decline it and I'll back their play on it. I actually had one of my team members decline an invite from a senior director. And then I get a message from the senior director, so and so keeps declining my invites. And I had to have the testicular fortitude, right? I had to have the balls to be able to say to that leader, you know, I, we have a precedence on our team that invites need to have an agenda. And so, agnostic of title, I would ask that you put what are the action items? That way, so and so can decide, is this the best use of their time or not? Needless to say, that leader didn't really like the feedback, but at least he understood it and corrected the behavior. So, again, just because just your title does not mean that you have lack of control of leadership. And in this case, I guess this guy was maybe one or two levels from the bottom rung. So he's not completely entry level, but not far from it. And through his actions, now the senior leader, the senior director, always puts agenda items. And in fact, I've seen him enforce it with his other team members because of that conversation. Okay. So other things that you can do to shape the culture is to use storytelling to reinforce a positive identity. What I mean here is that, we talked a little bit in our first episode on this series about the idea of building culture, of unlocking intrinsic motivation through Ryan and DC's theory of self-determination. And I've used that a lot in these podcasts, but frankly, it is the bedrock of what we do in industrial organizational psychology. It's this idea of, in order to unlock somebody's intrinsic motivation, they're going to need autonomy, belonging, and competence. So autonomy meaning I have the ability to do my job without being micromanaged. Belonging, I see value in what I'm doing and I belong on this team. And then competence, either I already have the skill set or I have the ability and the autonomy and the belonging to acquire the skill set. Okay. So to add an extra layer to that, if I can explain to my team the whys to the whats that we're doing, and I can fold that back into, we're doing task A because of cultural principle B, right? If I can connect those dots and help them see that, then I tend to, it kind of serves two purposes here, folks. It is going to reinforce your culture, but it is also going to unlock their intrinsic motivation. Now they want to do it, not just because the boss said to do it, but because they see value in doing so. And I always encourage people to use stories or analogies, break it down in a way that they're going to understand it. Even think of this podcast. This podcast at this point, we're getting airplay in over 10 countries across, I believe we're close to nearly 80 cities across the world. Okay. So a lot of folks are tuning in. And one of the things that I constantly use in these podcasts are storytelling. I give analogies, I give anecdotes to help take situations in my life and hopefully let them resonate in yours. Hey, sorry to interrupt the show. I just wanted to ask you a quick favor. If you are enjoying this content, consider a follow, a review, or if you're on YouTube, a like and subscribe. You can even comment directly and let me know what topics you might like me to discuss in the future. You can also reach out to me via any of the social media platforms. I'd love to engage further to understand how I can help your business. All right, enough of that. Back to the show. There's some true value in that, and that, again, helps to shape your culture. All right, so now that we've established that, let's pivot a little bit into, how do you turn around a culture that isn't working so well? So, first off, you have to get a baseline. You have to diagnose, right? Think about this like a doctor trying to treat a patient. I can't treat the patient if I have no idea what their symptoms are. And I don't know the severity. I can't qualify the symptoms if I don't know how long those symptoms have existed. If I don't understand their genesis, then I'm not a very good diagnostician in the first place. So, how do you do that? Well, there's a few different ways. And some of these are not going to work until you've established a baseline. So I'm going to give them to you in an order that has worked well for me. So take this with a grain of salt. I'm not going to tell you this is the magic formula, but this has worked well for me. So if I start off with surveys and I have a bad company culture because I haven't listened to your feedback in the past, because I have not given a shit about your opinion in the past, I can't expect to gain any true value from the survey. You don't trust me. You're not going to give me any feedback because you believe that it will go in one ear and out the other, right? Like giving advice to your kids, it only works if they actually do something with it, right? So, starting with surveys is making an assumption that you already have a good culture in the first place. If you believe that there is a toxicity level in the culture, whether you caused it or you inherited it is completely irrelevant. But if you start with a survey, garbage in, garbage out, people. Okay? What I would do first off is simple observation. Whenever I join a team, especially if I've inherited this team, so this isn't a team that I hired and established and built from the ground up. This is, I am the new guy and this team has existed. I need to understand what their culture is to begin with. First thing I'm going to do is be quiet. I'm going to go to meetings. I'm going to introduce myself, and then I'm going to sit back and just understand how things unfold. Now, go back to my first episode on this series. There's plenty of tips on how you're going to identify a bad culture. Okay, I'm not going to rehash those here. But if I observe that culture, I begin to understand what makes it tick. Whether or not these folks feel valued, whether or not they feel that they have been micromanaged, and really get a feel for how severe is it. Okay. So that's your first step. Sit back, take some notes, pay attention to behavior. It is really, really valuable here if you can be in person. If you can't be in person, I would encourage a little bit of peer pressure through turning on your cameras. Now, here we're going to use a little bit of science, a little bit of psychology on groupthink. Okay. If I get on a call and I'm the new guy and I say, turn on your cameras, what type of message does that send? Anybody? Any takers? I know you're thinking it. It sends the message of micromanaging. It says, Joe or Jane, new guy, new gal, doesn't trust me, wants to make sure I'm working, so they're going to tell me to turn on my cameras, right? You have just pissed in the face of your team, and now any shred of hope that you had about building this culture, now you have a big first step to overcome. So don't ask them to turn on their camera. Instead, we're going to use a little bit of groupthink, right? If I can get 2 to 3 people to follow my lead, usually the peer pressure gets everybody else too. And this isn't instantaneous, folks, but it will work. Trust me, I've done this a million times. I will turn on my camera, but before the meeting, I typically have had one-on-ones with folks. I get a feel for who are the decision makers, who are the cultural leaders of the team, right? Every team has somebody that other folks will look towards. And if you can get them on board, they will follow suit. So typically, I will start off with a combination of direct observation through one-on-ones and passive observation through simply attending meetings and not saying much past introductions and maybe a question here or there, but more a seeking to understand, not a why are you doing this? I know better, right? But more, can you help me understand your path here? You know, I notice you went this way. Can you tell me more about that? And I even just use that terminology. I'm truly seeking to understand. Don't think that I have any opinions or any background on this thing that I'm asking you about. I'm simply trying to view it through your lens. That's all, right? And if you come to it from a stance of humility, they will open up. And so I do that in the one-on-ones, in that cultural assessment. And through those conversations, now I'm going to figure out who is the person that's going to help me get those cameras on. And so I guarantee you, if you get on that call, and it may take a week, it may take a month, but you get on that call and you consistently have your camera on, even if you're the only one. As you build rapport with the team, you're going to get the second person, you're going to get the third person. And next thing you know, all the cameras are going to be on, but you didn't have to actually ask. It happens organically, and it was their decision. And because it was their decision, it will be more meaningful. They will turn it on because they will see the value in having it on. Okay. And this is a dynamic that we're dealing with as we've moved to this post-COVID world, especially in any of you that are listening to this podcast probably have the autonomy to not be into an office, which is why you have the ability to listen to me. Okay. So this is something that is not going away. We have to deal with it. Okay. So by having those one-on-ones and getting a feel for things, by having those cultural assessments, and eventually getting to the place where things like cameras being on and psychological safety is a thing, now your surveys actually carry weight. Now they actually matter. Again, if I did this as my first step, they didn't matter because nobody trusted me anyway. They were going to either not respond or just tell me what I want to hear, neither of which has any true value. Now, the next thing I'm going to ask you to do is, if you're going to bother giving a survey, share the results. I'll say that again for those that were sleeping. Share the results. If I don't give the results and I don't show that I took action because of those results, or ask questions or seek to understand, if I just take those and hide them away and say, well, I asked, they answered, now we'll move on, right? If I don't do anything with the survey data, then why bother asking? The next survey is going to be reduced in efficacy because I did nothing with this one. That is probably I guess if I was going to give you the secret sauce to impacting culture, that's it in a nutshell. That's what I've done with every team that I've ever managed. And I'm not trying to brag, but I haven't had, been at the same company now for 17 years. I've had a lot of different teams. I haven't had to interview for a lot of jobs or promotions. So I'd like to think that maybe this method works. And the best leaders that I've ever worked for or with have used this methodology. So this isn't just the gospel according to Luke. This isn't just crap that I'm making up or stuff that I've pulled out of the psychology books or out of my studies. I've seen it in action. I've emulated it, and I won't tell you I've perfected it because it's a journey that never really has a finish line. Okay. But that's my recommendation. Now, let's touch real quick on those one-on-ones. With your one-on-ones, I want you to make sure that you have a notebook set up. This can be digital, it can be physical, but make sure that you are taking some notes and referring back to those. If you want to establish a good culture, one of the easiest things that I have tried to do over the years is make sure that I write down names of spouses and children or pets, hobbies, those kinds of things, and make it a point to ask about them. It's no different than trying to connect with a friend, right? If you haven't seen a friend in a long time, do you ask them about their job? You suck as a friend. If that's where you're starting, you are not a good friend. Don't ask them about their job, right? You want to know about their life. You want to know if their health is well, if their spouse is well. What about that hobby that they like? You want to ask about those things. And then, the job stuff comes up. But frankly, if you've got a good working relationship with the team, do you have to ask about the job stuff? Don't you already know about the job stuff? You should. If you don't, you should go back and listen to some of my earlier podcasts. You haven't been paying attention. Okay? So that one-on-one is really, really critical to understanding your team culture and ultimately to be able to turn it around. You also, the other thing that this will help you do, and I touched on this a minute ago, but I'm going to go a little bit deeper here. It's identifying pockets of positivity as your culture carriers. So these are the folks that on your team that understand that where you are now is not where you want to be, and they have a shared vision. Typically, these are going to be the folks that, and frankly, these are the folks I tend to find them in the maybe unlikely places. So whenever I've joined a team, you usually have a person that is sort of negative. They've the I guess the best way I would describe it, if you can picture a boardroom, right? You walk in, you introduce yourself. Hi, I'm the new leader. I'm the new boss, and this person makes jokes. They tend to show a little bit of disrespect, a little bit of passive aggressive nature. Chances are this is just like a child acting out. Okay. They've had a bad experience with the past boss. They assume that the past will lay the foundation for the future. And so, because their last boss sucked, they believe you will suck too. And so they're just putting up their defenses. They're acting like this because they believe that at a subconscious level that you are going to do exactly what your predecessor did. Usually these are the folks, ladies and gentlemen, these are the unicorns on your team. They have the magic ideas that nobody ever listened to, nobody gave credence to in the past. And so just the fact that you asked their opinion, now you gained somebody to help you out with that groupthink a little bit. You've gained an ally just because you had the humility to ask. Most of the time, these folks have been there for a while and they feel good enough about the mission, or maybe it's just the money keeping them there, right? But lean into their experience. They're going to help you turn this culture around. Okay. So find your pockets of positivity and understand they don't usually start off as positive, but the 180 will make your head spin once you actually give them the time of day. Once you give them that little bit of credence and they know that you actually care about their opinion, now we've got a player. Now we've got somebody that can help you move the needle. Next thing I'm going to challenge you to do to turn around your culture is to communicate a clear cultural vision. So this is where you have to very quickly on this team establish what you will and will not tolerate. And sometimes that means putting your foot down, so to speak. So one of the things I established on the current team that I'm on, we had another leader that was, we'll just say they weren't playing nicely. And in front of the team, I, again, very politely and politically stood up for them. I put my foot down. I believe I used the phrase "no jerks" policy. And my role, I really could give two shits what your title is. I don't care what your education is, what your background is. The janitor gets the same respect as the CEO. That's just how I was raised. In fact, I can tell you right now, when I was a kid, if I would have walked through a grocery store or a fast food place, and I'm using those as examples because as a kid, that's, I didn't go into many office buildings. But if I were to walk into one of those places and disrespect a worker, it wouldn't matter what the title was. My mom would have laid into me, brother. I would have time traveled. She would have knocked me. Not that she was abusive or anything like that, but trust me, I would have caught a backhand or something. I would have definitely paid for that disrespect. And I carry that throughout my day job now. It doesn't matter where I am. It doesn't matter what your title is, what your education is. If you treat me with respect, you will get that respect back. Okay. So by clearly communicating that cultural vision, and and when I say clearly communicating, I'm not saying make a bunch of posters and put it up in the break room. I'm saying through your actions, clearly communicate what the vision is, and again, what you are ready to tolerate. Some other things that I will push for you to address a cultural turnaround. It depends on the level that you're at the company. You may have to clean house a little bit. So there's some training that you can give to your mid-level managers to make sure that they align to the values. And I say mid-level just meaning, the leadership on your team. And you have to be willing to understand that they are either going to drink the Kool-Aid, they are going to get on board with what you're trying to build, or they're going to find their meal elsewhere. Either way, problem solved, right? Once you've communicated and through your action and word that you will not tolerate anything else, the folks that maybe don't belong there, they'll find the door on their own. You won't have to do a whole lot to get rid of them. That goes back to the self-determination theory that we were talking about before, right? I'm going to beat this point into the ground. Autonomy, belonging, and competence. So if a person is missing any part of those three components, they eventually will find employment elsewhere. They will self-select out of the organization. And frankly, if they're only missing one of the three components, maybe that's a little slower. They're missing two, it's real fast. They're missing three, they've already left before I finish that sentence. So you're going to have to be okay with the idea that not everybody's going to drink the Kool-Aid. Not everybody is going to align to the values that you're establishing. And just like a drug addict that doesn't want to give up the crack cocaine, if they're not willing to help themselves, there is not a damn thing you can do to change that. So be okay with that. Set the precedence and let the garden weed itself. Okay? With that, I need you to be comfortable with addressing toxicity quickly, with accountability and empathy. What I mean is that especially if you have inherited this team, the leaders on the team, the associates on the team, they might not have had a good example. Okay. So think of it like this. If you are an adoptive parent, you're taking in a child that has had poor examples all their life. They sit down at your kitchen table and they throw their elbows up there and they start eating with their mouth open. Do you pick them up by the scruff of the neck and throw them out the front door? Get out of my house. You're not welcome here. Well, no. You give them some empathy. You give them some understanding. You explain the proper behavior, the reason for the proper behavior, and establish the consequences going forward. Once you've done that, yeah, then it's okay to be a little bit more stern. I'm not telling you to ever kick that adoptive child out of your house. It was awful nice of you to bring them into the fold. Strong kudos out there to anybody that has been in that position, by the way. But to continue this analogy here, you're always seeking to try and build them up. Now, at some point, you have to be aware that there might not be anything that you can do, and that's okay too. Okay. Just like that child, that adoptive kid, eventually they're going to be to the age and the experience that they're going to make their own decisions. Now, is that your fault? Well, no. They're an adult. They pave their own way, so to speak. Um, and the same goes for your employees. They're either going to get on board or they're going to get out. And that often is a function of how you address toxicity. If you allow the team to talk to one another like jerks, well, then are you really surprised when they're a jerk to you? You shouldn't be. Another easy thing to do to celebrate culture is to make sure that you're incentivizing and celebrating the types of things that are are meaningful for you. So I'm going to give you an easy example to follow here. I hear so many companies, even the one that I work for now, that they're constantly talking about work-life balance, and we don't want you to get burnt out and this, that, and the other. They're always chanting that mantra. But then I hear somebody getting an award, a monetary bonus because they worked a ton of extra hours. Well, did you work a ton of extra hours because you were poorly managing your work-life balance? Do you do that consistently? Because that's contributing to burnout, right? I have conflicting messages there. And so instead, that's not to say that you don't celebrate that win, right? That person got a project done. Celebrate the win. Don't don't mention the fact that they put in a lot of hours to get that win. That needs to be a separate conversation between you and them to understand, did they work those extra hours because they were super passionate about it and just weren't paying attention to the clock? Well, that's okay, right? We still want to help give them the foundation to say, set limits, set timers, don't consistently work late. That's not good for you. That's not good for your family. That doesn't give you the best version of yourself for your family or for work. And notice there, I put family first, even in my sentence structure. If I say family first, and then every time I praise you, I praise the work that you're doing and not the value that you're bringing to your family, my deed and my word don't match up. Conflicting messages. Okay. So celebrating those wins, but do so in a way that aligns with the values and the culture that you've established. So they stayed late to work on a project. The project was completed and everybody was happy. Great. Let's celebrate the fact that the project was completed and everybody was happy. Let's address on the back end, why did you have to stay late? Is it because as a leader, maybe I didn't give you the right support? Did I put too much on you and you didn't feel comfortable telling me that you were drowning in the weight of all this work? Right? Those are things I can address. I can take that feedback and I continue to build the culture by doing something about the feedback that I asked you to give me. Okay. All right. So some call to action, and we're almost out of time, folks, but call to action for you. What is one behavior that you can model this week to support a thriving culture? Think through that. What is one behavior that you can model this week in support of a thriving culture? Now that you have that in your head, I'm going to ask you to consider a culture audit or a feedback loop as your very first step. I'm hoping at this point that you already have one-on-one scheduled. You can certainly adjust the model based on my recommendations there. Go back and adjust that a little bit. But do a cultural assessment. Figure out where you have gaps and how you can get a feedback loop established so that you can start correcting some of these. All right. Well, folks, that is all I had for you today. I'm going to have some links as to the resources to this conversation in the description of the podcast itself. If you have questions for me, if you have a team culture issue that you want to talk through, hit me up on DMs. Let's start a conversation. You can also find this full podcast out on YouTube. The comment section there is maybe a little bit easier than on some other platforms. So let's have a discussion. How can I help your organization to either expand on a thriving culture or correct a toxic culture? All right, folks. Have a great day. We'll talk again soon. Bye-bye.
Hey, you made it all the way to the end of the podcast. Thank you so much for spending a little bit of time with me. Again, if you like this content, don't hesitate to reach out. You can also connect with me on my various social media accounts. So reach out. Let's have a conversation. I look forward to working with you. Have a great day.